All right. All right. That was odd. Okay. So, talking about the city of Madison finances today, you guys can interrupt me at any time. I'll probably have trouble seeing the chat. So, people, Jason, can you watch the chat for me, please? Um,
Absolutely.
okay, great. So, let me just start this. All right. So anyway, the Wisconsin Policy Forum, we're a nonpartisan organization. We're very, very old. That is the point of this slide. We do have members that are government, school district, corporate members, nonprofits, and would always looking to add to our group. So don't hesitate to reach out if you're interested in that. Every year we do a variety of things. We publish about 52 reports and briefs a year, about one a week. But one of the things we do is look at the budgets of some of the major local and state governments in Wisconsin. And so that involves looking at the Madison School District budget and the City of Madison budget every year. So I'll probably get into the weeds a fair amount this morning, but the takeaways here for you, if you don't remember anything else, the City of Madison has at this moment strong finances, pretty high levels of per capita spending, pretty high levels of services. The city has very strong reserves. It has fantastic, um, pension and healthcare uh, funds in terms of how those are funded for retirees. Those are in terrific shape. Has relatively high per capita debt levels, but also has high property values and is able to service that debt. On the whole, today the City of Madison budget is and finances are strong. The challenge I think that we see is that revenues are not growing as fast as expenditures for the city if you look in recent years. And the city doesn't really have a path or a plan right now for how it's going to keep its finances strong over the next, let's say, 3 to 6 years. So without, some kind of course correction, there's going to be a deterioration in this strength over time. And we'll spend the next few minutes here talking about why that is. Just real basics. Here's what the city's general fund budget, its main set of accounts, what that looks like. You can see that on the revenue side, about a little over 70% of the city's revenues come from the property tax. So very, relatively little state aid for the city. So on the one side, very heavily property tax dependent for the budget, and then on the other side, you have more than half of the city's budget goes to police, fire, and debt payments. So, and then, would probably go up to, I don't know, 70%, something like that, if you included public works and streets. So, the city services are concentrated in relatively few areas. Here's a look at the city's overall budget gap this year. It started out with about a $28 million budget gap, and sort of how the city's budget gap would be resolved under the mayor's budget. Everything I'm talking about today, it still reflects the proposal that the mayor put out. Typically doesn't see a lot of changes from the city council, although there's always going to be some. The city did get relatively strong revenue growth of $18 million, but it had a one-time fee or a one-time cost of restoring city funding for Madison Metro Transit that had been lowered because of pandemic relief funds from the federal government. So those are a couple and big ones. The city also has been increasing wages for workers to reflect inflation. That's added significantly to costs. And then, as you can see, under the mayor's proposed budget, there would be, I think it's $16.7 million total in one-time money that would be used to balance the budget. So this would be funding that, is available now but might not be available in the future or will not be available in the future in the case of ARPA funds. So it drawing money out of the city's general fund balance, using federal COVID stimulus, and then some money left over from the closure of tax increment districts. Here's what the city's general fund gaps have looked like over time. The gap was bigger this year, and in theory, those gaps could continue to grow over time. When you look out at the out years of this chart, like 27 to 29, don't pay a ton of attention to those, because really what happens in those out years depends on whether or not the city finds sustainable solutions. If the city finds in the next couple years sustainable revenue increases or spending cuts, then you're not going to see that steady growth in the projected gap over time. If the city does rely on one-time measures that like the use of reserves, then you would see that continue to be there. One of the big challenges that the city has faced for the last several years, is this proposed budget would increase spending by 5.9%. That would be roughly the third year in a row that spending would increase by around 6%. That's challenging for the city because it just simply isn't getting growth in its revenues, sustainably at that level. And we can talk a little bit more later on about that. Here's what that spending increase is going toward. Again, I talked about Metro Transit. The city had been using ARPA funds to help defray the cost of that service to the public during the pandemic, when the city's overall budget has been stretched and ridership has been down. The mayor's proposal restores that general fund or property tax funding for Metro Transit, and then provides some additional funding to sort of make up for the funding that was city funding that was not present during the pandemic. You're seeing in other departments, you're seeing, police, fire, some of these other departments, you're seeing increases which reflect the wage bumps that employees are receiving. A few other things here, debt payments continue to go up, and then you see the city clerk in 2024 has got to run a presidential election, so there's an added cost associated with that. There's about 15 employees that would be added to the payroll for the city under the mayor's budget. A lot of those are in Metro Transit. In addition, general employees would be getting 6% wage increases over the course of the year. That'd be broken into January and July, two chunks that would add up to about 6%. And then police and fire employees would be getting a 3% bump. Worth noting that under Wisconsin law, there's still got to be collective bargaining for most employment issues take place with police and firefighter employees. And that's, after the passage of Act 12 back in 2011, that was no longer the case for general city. And here's what the property tax increases look like over time for the city. Under the mayor's proposal, the levy would increase by about 4.6%. So roughly the rate of inflation. And for the average home, in typical home in Madison, it'd be a little less than that. I think 3.8, something like that. We also have continued to see, some increases in fees for the city. That reflects a couple things. One, the caps that are present that the state puts on property taxes for the city. It, reflects the cost of some of these services. The city introduced, I think it was in 2019, might have been in 2018, this urban forestry fee that's relatively new. That's grown steadily over time. All of the stormwater, sewer, and water bills for the city the rates have grown fairly rapidly over time. That reflects the cost of those services, but also the fact that, and this was from a brief we published earlier this year, there's been a huge drop in actual water use in Madison, and that's both residential, commercial, and industrial. But here we're just showing you the drop in industrial water use in the city, almost 1 billion gallons since 1997. That reflects both industry becoming more efficient, but also, more notably, the closure of Oscar Mayer's plant, what was this Sara Lee bakery, a couple dairies. And so what happens is the city, these, as the water usage drops, the city's got to increase rates to have the same amount of revenue that it did before. And as it increases rates, then it incentivizes people to, reduce their water use, and the cycle sort of begins all over again. So that's something that we've been watching for the city for some time. You can see that one of the biggest drops in water use by industry in the state over the past generation. Here's a look at Madison's capital budget. So the capital budget under the mayor's proposal this year would be roughly $265 million. That would be roughly $100 million below where the capital budget was last year. The main difference is in the bus rapid transit, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But that has been the east-west route that is, we're starting to see work on around the city that would go from sort of East Town to West Town roughly. That has been funded, and the city's on a pause before it starts funding the north-south route of the next BRT line. And so that's why you're seeing the drop in funding this year. Could be a little bit of a pickup next year. A lot of the BRT funding has been federal, so it's not as much an impact on what the city itself is doing. All right, one of the things that we've tracked carefully over time is the increase in debt, just debt levels and debt payments for the city of Madison. Those have been a little bit more stable in recent years and would again be relatively stable under the mayor's proposed budget. You would see those projected to grow, though, in future years. This is kind of important to look at because as the city ends up paying more for debt, it's going to, crowd out or potentially crowd out, other services like police and fire and streets and public health. So here's one of the big findings that we had for this year's brief. As I know Representative Hung is aware, the legislature passed very significant legislation around funding local governments in the state through a bill act now known as Act 12, and then also through the state budget. For some, this was a historic change. It both provided a big increase in the form of discretionary state aid to local governments known as shared revenue. And it also provided that aid will grow according to the sales tax revenues in the future. That's significant because for 20 years we've really had state aid to local governments stagnate. Um, and you can see what a big deal this was for many communities. What this shows you here is um, in the main form of shared revenue, it's known as county and municipal aid, how much would be going to all the municipalities in the state, which there's more than 1,800 of them, following the passage of Act 12. So you add up the shared revenue that they formerly got or previously got, plus the new aid. This is where the different municipalities are at. Madison got about $11 per capita, or about $3 million in total from Act 12. That was a big percentage increase for the city. It was like a 60% increase, something like that. But because the city really didn't get much shared revenue to begin with, it was much less than the typical municipality got. The typical municipality in Wisconsin got about $30, 20, or from that, maybe 35, something like that from Act 12. And so what happened is when Madison received the least help under Act 12 on a per capita basis of any of the 1,848 municipalities in the state. And now is basically second to last for um, the the amount it receives. Like Milwaukee receives about $400 per resident in county municipal aid. Madison about $29. The average for cities around the state is $195. Average for just all municipalities is about $142. So if Madison were getting the average for municipalities, that would be another something like $30 million for the city's budget. There's a couple ways to look at this. Definitely one way to look at it is Madison is very well to do. We benefit from having state government and the university here. And, arguably, we can afford to pay our own way in a way that many communities cannot. One challenge, though, is that we're not actually allowed under state law to tax ourselves at the level that elected officials want without a referendum. The other way of looking at this is all of the 1,248 towns in Wisconsin now receive more per capita in state aid than Madison does. One reason that's significant is as a large city, Madison does need to have, street lights, storm sewers, sanitary sewers, police service, libraries, things like that. Many of these smaller communities do not provide those services and don't actually spend for those things. So, this is just one of the realities of the city's finances going forward. Because this was a historic piece of legislation, typically things that are historic do not happen in quick succession, boom, boom. So I think the fact that the legislature passed this bill is going to make it much less likely that it would do something similar going forward. The other thing, obviously, that Act 12 did is it provided additional sales tax authority to both the city of Milwaukee and Milwaukee County. The governor would have extended that sales tax authority to, I think, any community with more than 30,000 residents, which certainly would have included Madison. That was not included, in the final state budget by the legislature. So, this is sort of an important thing to know as you think about what the city will do with its finances going forward. Okay, I'm just going to try and run through quickly here some of the big challenges that are remaining for the city's budget. One of them is the hit to transit ridership. and as a result to the revenues available to Madison Metro to provide services. So you can see that ridership has started to recover from 2019 levels, but is still, something like 30% below where it was in 2019. Most of that is the pandemic. There's also some things like the Madison schools removed middle school students from the Madison Metro buses and put them on yellow school buses. So that had an effect. But we're still down significantly. We have seen since this summer and the route redesign that Metro Transit did, we've seen ridership bounce up a significant amount over those months. So that is encouraging, but we still got a long ways to go. And so that will be a challenge for Madison Metro as, ARPA funding runs out and they still are not back to where, they were in terms of revenue. I think BRT, as we have that service roll out, that could boost ridership significantly, and that could be a big help to this. Another thing that has been a help is Metro Transit has been expanding, its services to communities like Sun Prairie and receiving some additional revenue from those communities. So that's another thing that is, a bright spot. But, this is a significant thing to watch going forward and something that we remain concerned about. The room tax fund has recovered more strongly. So here you can see the tremendous hit that, this source of revenue for the city took during the pandemic and how it has recovered relatively strongly. It's worth noting that we're still not back to an inflation adjusted figure for 2019. So, inflation's up about 20% since 2019, and we're not quite, covering what 2019 levels would be if you adjusted them for inflation, but we're getting closer. This is important to track because, most of this money does not go toward general city services. Most of this money goes towards funding things connected to the tourism and visitors. So, the Monona Terrace Convention Center, the Overture Center, the zoo, Destination Madison, some of these entities. I know Destination Madison recently, reached a new agreement with the city or an amended agreement about its funding levels. That still is not on track to where I know Destination Madison had hoped to be prior to the pandemic, under the sort of schedule of payments, I guess you could say, that existed in 2019. So, more progress here, but I think there's going to continue to be some pressure on all the services that are funded from room taxes in the city. And those are, under current state law, to my understanding, maxed out in terms of what the city could levy. All right, so here is a look at the parking utility fund. I realize this is not the sexiest thing for you guys to look at, but this is important. And obviously, we still have very significant working from home. Here we are, many of us, we can see on the Zoom are logging in from our homes. And that you still see that continued hit to the parking utilities budget. It has been surviving through one-time sources of money. That's included the sale of air rights and for development above city parking garages that are getting redeveloped, like the one on Wilson Street. but we continue to, the city, the fund balance of the parking utility fund is also being used, but that is not where it needs to be in terms of what the actual expenses are of the parking utility. So I think, one of the questions long term is, does the city need to change its footprint or, sort of cost structure for the parking utility to make that sustainable? Big thing that is happening in I think it's a year to come, but it's certainly very soon, is the redevelopment of half of the State Street lot, which I think is the city's biggest, seller of most used parking lot. There's going to be a major redevelopment happen there that includes housing, a transit hub, and a rebuilding of some of the city's parking in that structure as well. All right, so obviously, one reason why, one thing that's affecting transit and parking revenues in the city is just the continued prevalence of work from home. And with our high proportion here in Madison and Dane County of professional, white collar, Zoomable jobs, you're seeing that be more of an impact here than it would in some other, communities around the state, like, Janesville or Eau Claire or, what have you. All right. So, the last thing I wanted to talk to you about here, and I'll stop sharing, is what options are available to the city given this sort of mismatch that it currently has between its growth in revenues and its growth in spending. As you guys know, the forum we don't advocate for or against particular policies, but I'm just going to try and be an honest broker here and give you some examples. One thing I think that is something for the city to continue to explore is ways to deliver services regionally. And so we gave you the example of Madison Metro. There could be potentially other options to look at ways to partner with neighboring communities to deliver services either at a higher level or for less money. To give you an example, right now, Wanakee and the city of Middleton have approached us about doing a service sharing project where they would combine their EMS services. They would also extend that to some of the towns. I don't know if that study is going to happen or not, but these are the sorts of things that communities are looking at to try and be more efficient. The Metro Transit, again, is a good example of that. I think there's always opportunities for the city to look at that. It's not going to be a panacea or a cure-all, but it's certainly something to consider. The city can look at other ways to reduce its costs. I mean, one thing that the city could look at is to try and limit employee pay raises. That's heavily labor dependent. The city, the challenge there is the city already has elevated levels of turnover and elevated levels of vacancies, and so there's going to be a real tension between holding down compensation for employees and getting good employees and enough employees to do the city's work. Another option for the city would be to lobby the legislature to extend sales tax authority to the city of Madison, as it did for the first time, really, for a major city, for Milwaukee here in the recent over the summer. Again, that's ultimately going to be the purview of the legislature, right? And I would not say that they have seemed overly open to the majority seemed overly open to that idea. We have someone from the assembly on the call who could certainly weigh in with her thoughts on that. Another issue that the city could look at is the idea of a property tax referendum. The city does have that ability under state law. The forum has established in our research that we are seeing more cities and villages and towns put ballot questions to voters about increasing their um, their property taxes beyond the state levy limit. The way it works right now is all of the city's property taxes that are used for operations, for the operating budget, not the capital, not debt payments, but for the operations, those are limited the growth each year to the growth in the rate of net new construction in the city. And in Madison, net new construction compared to the rest of the state is pretty strong. It was for this purposes of this budget, it was 2.2%, which statewide average is 1.7%. So we're way above where the statewide average is in Madison. But if you look at 2.2%, this that's roughly half the current rate of inflation over the past year, something like that. So again, when you look at Madison receiving relatively little state aid, having property taxes capped relatively tightly, at least for operations, there's some additional property tax increases that happen each year for debt. A referendum is something that I think you'll see city leaders talk about. We don't have a position on it. One challenge to doing a referendum next year, and Melinda could probably speak to this, is that we're certainly going to see one, I think, from the school district. I rate that likelihood as extremely high. And I don't think it would happen in the spring for the school district. I guess it's possible, but it seems like more would need to be done to till the ground for that. So it seems possible to me that in the fall of 2024, you could have a referendum for both the school district and the city on the budget. I don't know how voters would react to that. I mean, typically they've been pretty supportive of referendums that have been put to them. There are some other communities in the state that have done that. Middleton, in I think 2022, voters there passed both a school district and a city property tax referendum. But for some voters, that shoe may pinch a little bit. So that, as I have it for you, is sort of some of the high level options that would be sustainable. Obviously, the city could continue. It has roughly a $60 million general fund balance, give or take 5 million, something like that. It could certainly get by for, a year to 3 years by sort of using one-time sources of money and accounting tricks and things like that. It's certainly not a case where the city would have to take action immediately. But in terms of what are the things that would be sustainable for the city's finances and help it keep its AAA bond rating, those would be the sorts of things that would come up. And so you guys have been super patient, haven't interrupted me at all. So now I will just put it to you guys to any questions or corrections or clarifications that you might want.
Thank you so much, Jason. Questions? Quiet group so far.
Can you, well, Jason, thank you for a terrific presentation. Would it be possible to go back to the slide that you showed Madison at the very bottom of a very long curve in terms of how much, I believe it was per resident that we're receiving from the state?
Yep, and I'll try and give you that rather than the ultimate frisbee player. Is it which is it? Which you got?
Well, and I guess my question on that is, and I guess I understand pretty well kind of how we got to the very right side of the page, as it were. What are the potential mechanisms to change that trajectory? I mean, again, understanding the conditions, why we're down there, but it seems pretty that's pretty shocking, really.
It was, I'll tell you, Matt, it was surprising to me. I knew that we would be low, that we would be basically the lowest in the state, and that we would be below every town was surprising to me. Just to explain why we are here, to give you the very quick summary of the history of the world. In the 90s, we had a shared revenue formula that was tilted toward communities with low property values. And the idea was to help them afford a higher level of service, and that communities with higher property values would have an easier time funding that off the property tax. Then, we had a series of cuts to shared revenue. I think they were in let's see, I think 2004, 2010, and 2012. And in each of those cases, the methodology that the legislature came up with for making those cuts was disadvantageous to Madison. I don't know in every case that was the intent, but so we sort of each time, and then certainly, the formula that was used this time around, which was very heavily weighted towards small communities under Act 12, in each time the legislature makes a significant change to shared revenue, and this has been including both parties, but certainly, this was a Republican authored plan this time around, it's been very disadvantageous for Madison. And so that's sort of how we have ended up in this situation. I think long term, I think there's an argument to be made for saying to policymakers at the state level, look, we realize that Madison may not be your favorite locality, but a lot of the job creation that happens in the state of Wisconsin happens, in the greater Madison area. And there are, the growth that the city is seeing, the increase in residents. There are costs associated with that, and that for the sort of overall economic development of the state of Wisconsin, having, a somewhat more logical, I think, funding framework for our second largest city, just purely looking at it from the standpoint of not people living in Madison, but just economic growth for the state of Wisconsin as a whole, you could make the argument that there should be some kind of adjustment to this picture. Again, I think the challenge politically is the legislature has just done this very, very large package, and is probably not going to want to come back and do another one. I mean, we do continue to have a projected general fund balance of $4 billion for June 30th, 2025 as a state. So the kitty is not empty for the state of Wisconsin. It could come back and do something. It's just sort of my professional opinion that it probably will not. But I think, it certainly will not it certainly won't do it if there isn't a sustained effort to sort of make the case on it from the part of, the leadership, private and public sector leadership of the city. And I'm not trying to say that maybe hasn't happened, but, clearly we haven't yet reached the point where that has been impactful. Yeah, the difference between, being at this average per resident of $142 is, and where we're at now in terms of our per capita payments, about 30 million. I would guess that's probably about 40 million. The difference between if we were just got the average of a city in Wisconsin and so that's, and again, what is the city's general fund budget? General fund budget in under the mayor's proposal, about $400 million for the city of Madison. So, 30, 40 million, that's a real significant, I don't know, 7.5%, 10% of the budget, something like that. Yeah.
I want to welcome Dan Kennelly
Hey,
and
Dan, how's it going?
our new colleague on my staff, Caleb Klinsky, who's our new advocacy coordinator. So welcome. Sorry I didn't catch you earlier. Other questions for Jason Stein?
I might chime in. This is Dan. Thanks, Melinda, for the shout out. And thanks, Jason. Super interesting presentation. One thing just to mention that at the end you kind of talked about the list of, well, here are things that we could potentially do. And fairly obvious, and probably just goes without saying, but a lot of this comes down to net new construction, as you pointed out.
Yep.
So
Yep.
perhaps, worth noting that, among the other maybe creative solutions that you mentioned, a key piece of the solution is just continuing to create opportunities to build buildings in Madison. And, there's a lot of, from the city's standpoint, there's a fair amount of city-owned real estate. There's state-owned properties, the Brayton lot is on the table. There's the Jeff buildings that we've all heard. There's the Alliant Energy Center campus. And we're in this fortunate position where we're a city that people want to live in, and we're not keeping up with demand for housing. So there's kind of a, like just building more housing and just building more buildings sort of provides the dual function of creating a lot of tax base, increasing our revenue capacity, as well as helping solve, our housing problem. So again, an obvious, fairly obvious answer, but just worth noting.
I think that's a great suggestion. And, unlike a community like, let's say, Minneapolis or something like that, where, structures could be built outside the city limits, but, workers could still drive into the city, pay sales taxes, the city would still benefit, right? Even if it was perhaps for whatever reason not facilitating development. For the city of Madison, that doesn't occur in that fashion. And so, it is really important for the city that it continues to have growth within the city limits. It's, obviously not there's still benefits to having the growth in the broader metro area, but yeah, no, that's a great point.
Yeah. Anything else? Jason Ilstrup, do you have any burning questions?
Oh, Jason and I were we were on a tour together, so I was able to ask him a lot of questions last week. So I'm doing pretty well. Any other questions from the team?
I actually have two.
You have a question for yourself?
I have two questions for you guys.
Oh no, that's not how this works. Oh my goodness. Okay, yes, of course.
One is for Melinda. I mean, Melinda,
good.
What do you think about the school referendum situation? I mean, do you have a sense of timing on that, or I don't want to put you on the spot, but I'm just curious.
We're obviously talking through things. Historically, if we've gone to referenda, it's been intentionally November, intentionally presidential years.
Right.
Looking at data in the last two presidential cycles, when we are at operating referendum or a combined referenda package, you definitely see responses to those ballot questions tracking closely with the vote patterns for the presidential election. So, I know my colleagues at the district understand that, right, and would likely stay true to that past practice.
Yeah, for those who don't remember, the previous Madison school referendums, I think, happened both November of 2016, I think, and November of 2020. So quick question to you guys. The forum is obviously doesn't take positions on any issues and wouldn't on either a city or school district referendum, but we would consider doing, some sort of report or some sort of publication. I mean, it could range from an op-ed in the paper that just had basic information to, one of our longer reports on the question of, that might answer questions the public have about referenda. And so I'd be curious now or in the future if you guys have thoughts on, do you think that would be helpful for the community if we did that? If we were to do it, what would be the kinds of questions that you would like to see answered? So just to take your all's temperature on that.
I mean, I can start. I get a general sense that the community is beginning to understand that the city has budget issues this year and into the future. But I don't seem to think that people understand the options about how to move out of that. So basically that last section that you spoke of, right? When you put the slides down, I really don't think they know referendum, net new property, all these different things that could cuts, obviously, that could happen. And I think it would benefit the community to be able to understand that because, you showed in the slide, I mean, this is going to get worse 25, 26, 27, right? So I think the more we can help inform the community about what the options are that are out there, all of the options, I think that's beneficial. But I would love to hear what the committee has to say too, of course.
I think it would be helpful for you to play the role of educator and help people understand, especially as we're in a rising interest rate environment. Interest rates are much higher right now than they were a few years ago, and I don't think everybody really understands the implications for that. So to the extent that you can help educate the public, I think that's a win for everyone.
Okay, great. Well, Jason, I may, we can, for now, it's somewhat premature because, nothing's been, put forward by either the district or the city, but, as we sort of go through the year, we can remain in touch on that. And, it's certainly something that we're thinking about or starting to think about. But we have to, we kind of have a production schedule. So we like trying to, make sure that, we leave some blank space in that calendar. So.
I mean, I just think it's going to become more of a perplexing question, right? And so getting the information out there, I think, is important. As even groups like us that are advocates, as we're advocating for, really understanding what's happening with the budget and what are the options, I think is important. So we would certainly be supportive of that, and whatever, you and I are in constant contact. So whatever you need from us, let us know.
Okay, terrific.
Hey, one more question. I guess, I mean, definitely, Jason, you explain this stuff better than anybody. So yeah, the more your voice is part of the discussion, I think the better. I'm curious, pay some attention to the school district referenda. Are there examples in Wisconsin of municipalities that have adopted property tax referendums? Like, does that happen?
It does. So the school districts it's much more common for that to occur, but you do see some of it, and I can put in the chat, we have seen an uptick in the number of communities that have done referenda. I think you will see that slow down, in 2024, probably for most types of communities, because again, smaller communities made out very well during Act 12, and in some cases, some small towns are going to get the ability to do things that they could just have never dreamed about. However, I do think your larger cities, particularly ones that have high property values, so like your Madisons, your Brookfields, your Waukeshaws, some of those communities are probably are sort of in the same boat as Madison, and you're going to, I think, see some of them continue to look at things like that. And I'll find in the chat something that we did in 2022 that kind of breaks down some of these this trend towards seeing more cities and villages and towns do referendum and not just school districts.
Thanks.
I just wanted to add here at the end that I think that especially communicating the ways in which the revenue side, like the limited options on revenue is really important, because I think that as the city, as our community moves towards potential referendum, there are going to be questions and more proposals about like what are the potential services that we're willing to cut and what that looks like. And so I think that education piece about what are the ways in which we increase revenue will be a good balance, compared to saying like, how would you feel if recycling only came once every 3 weeks, right? Like, because that's going to obviously be like the alternative option that, the city and us as a community are going to have really hard conversations about. And so I think that, the ways in which the policy forum in particular can educate on the limited options revenue wise, through editorial, through whatever, is going to be really helpful.
And that's, certainly a point with respect to cities and villages we have made, and I put it in the chat. But we published a report in 2019 that looked at, what are the financing options that are available for cities and villages in particular in Wisconsin. And, that report found very clearly that, Wisconsin is very unusual in its heavy reliance on the property tax. And so, we're similar to our, overall share of taxes as a share of local budgets compared to other Midwestern states, but much higher percentage of property taxes. So most other, Midwestern states provide a local option sales tax, or in a few cases like Ohio, it's an income tax, but, generally there's some other option besides the property tax. And again, economists love the property tax. They feel like it's a great way, it taxes wealth, doesn't tax income. It isn't a disincentive for people to add to their income. But at the same time, your average homeowner is not a huge fan of the property tax. And that's, a challenge, I think, for the local officials. It, as much as the economists might love it, it can be a challenge with the voters sometimes.
Also, Jason, I think though most residents of Madison know that we receive a fairly low amount from the state, that actual chart that of per resident, and that we're next to the bottom in the 1,800 plus municipalities, in the state, would really bring it home to people. I don't think they realize, I never realized precisely how much, even Milwaukee gets 400 and something, and we're down, to $1.98 or the equivalent.
It surprised me too, Eve. I knew we would be low, but I was somewhat surprised.
And we're right at 9 o'clock.
Yeah, Kit, did you I saw
Oh,
you
I'm sorry.
you want to
Kit,
say
I didn't see
too?
you.
Yeah, sorry.
I was just going to ask what the total amount is, because we're all talking about per
yeah,
capita,
per
but I
person.
wanted to know the total amount.
Yep. The
Good question.
total amount in Madison is, for county municipal aid, about $8 million. So that's about 2% of Madison's general fund budget of 400 million. The city of Milwaukee would be, and Milwaukee's very high compared to most other communities, but city of Milwaukee would be like, I don't know, like 220 million, something like that, in terms of county municipal aid payment. I don't know where we would rank on the absolute number. But yeah, so, it's again, Act 12 provided $3 million to the city. So that's maybe like, it's not a full percentage point to the budget, but it's like 0.75%. So, it wasn't nothing. It's helpful. It would cover the increased wages for the police department for this year. So it's not nothing. And certainly the city gets a ton of help from the state in terms of having, a world-class university cited here and all the other things, that the state tax dollars do in Madison. So it's not to say like, oh, woe is Madison, and oh, it's so terrible to be us. But, just to say at the same time, this is the reality, and, how do we deal with it as a community?
All right. Well, when next we see you, hopefully, be Tuesday, December 5th. Jason, the I, is working on possibly one, if not two, alders being with us, MGR Govindarajan, hopefully get that somewhat close, and possibly Alder Juliana Bennett. So hope to see you in a month. Thank you again, Jason Stein, for your time, expertise, and a very happy Thanksgiving to everyone. If you're traveling, safe travels, and have a great rest of the week. Take care.
You.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.